All right, we're going to talk about the elements of drama. So, when we're analyzing drama, we're analyzing anything that's scripted to be on a stage. So, a play, a musical, a monologue, whatever those are considered drama because they are meant for dramatic purposes. For our unit, we are going to focus in on characters and structure just because those two things are really important in a play in general. Um, I think things like setting don't always affect a play. For example, Shakespeare, the setting is usually kind of vague or very general and oftentimes doesn't really play a huge role. So, analyzing the characters and structure is kind of a little bit more universal with drama. Let's start by talking about how we analyze characters. So, we're going to use Romeo because Romeo and Juliet is something we're all kind of familiar with. And these bullet points over here are kind of the key essential skills that AP wants you to have. So they want you to be able to, for example, analyze the significance of a character's background, figure out how characters are similar or different. We've talked about character relationships a lot. So we're just going to do the same thing with Romeo. Most of these apply just like they did with prose when we're talking about drama, but there are some changes. For example, when we're talking about psychological, emotional, and physical descriptions in a play, these are usually pretty limited, and there's a reason for that. When a playwright is writing their script, they have to remember that any number of actors are going to play this person. Each actor will have their own interpretation. So they kind of leave that explicit description to the very bare minimum. Now, if it's relevant that a character has black hair, it'll say that in the script. But usually, playwrights try to be as limited with that type of explicit description. However, character backgrounds, that we can do with Romeo. If you remember, Mr. Romeo was in love with Rosalind in the beginning of the play, and he is also from the Montague family. Both of those things are relevant because, as you know, the feud between the families creates the conflict of the play, and his love for Rosalind is the reason he attends the party where he meets Juliet. So those two pieces of his character, his background, can be analyzed to talk about how he is impetuous or impulsive. You could use it to talk about how he is defiant and that he goes against what his family says. His motivations, I think this right here, love is Romeo's greatest motivation. I mean, he's kind of a hopeless romantic throughout the play, right? He is determined and fixated on Rosalind, but as soon as Juliet comes, it changes and spends the whole play, obviously, as you know, pursuing that love with Juliet. So love is a huge motivation for Romeo. Remember, when we're talking about character motivations, we want to talk about those big ideas, those big values that they have, because you don't want to just say that Romeo's motivation is to marry Juliet or to be with Juliet. That's literal and that's surface level, and remember, we're trying to get to that figurative level that analysis is at. Character contrasts and commonalities. So if we compared him to Friar John, for example, Friar John is very level-headed and he thinks about things carefully, whereas Mr. Romeo is very impulsive. That would be a contrast between those two characters. If we're talking about commonalities, I forgot his friend's name. Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. Mercutio. Mercutio is dramatic, and that is a commonality that the two share. Obviously, we know Romeo is dramatic because of the end of the play where he kills himself thinking he can't be with Juliet anymore. But if you think to Mercutio's scenes, especially in the movie, I think it's highlighted well, the old one, but his speech about Queen Mab, in which he's kind of teasing Romeo about his dreams and things like that, and then when he's fighting with Tybalt, in both he's very dramatic. So that is a commonality between those two characters. So looking at those two things, if I was going to analyze those, I could talk about how youth, so Mercutio and Mr. Romeo, is impulsive and dramatic, whereas age brings wisdom, which would be Friar John. And that would be an analysis, an interpretation of what Shakespeare was trying to say. Character relationships. Obviously, the most prominent relationship with Romeo is his love for Juliet. That relationship can be analyzed any number of ways. You can talk about how love blinds us. You can talk about how love needs to overcome any fight or feud. You could talk about how it's a cautionary tale about youth and love. There's lots of ways you could analyze that relationship. Remember when we get that phrase in our FRQs that says, what makes the relationship complex? We could say something in terms of Romeo and Juliet, like they are obsessed, or they have an obsessive relationship, or their relationship is ignorant. You could say it's unconditional. Those would all be ways to kind of define the complexity in their relationship. The character perspective for Romeo, like I said, Shakespeare often uses characters that, they have their depth, but I think Romeo is an example of one where his youth kind of simplifies his perspective, because as we talked about, he really does have tunnel vision for Miss Juliet. But in regards to his family feud, I think we can tell that Romeo's perspective is that he kind of doesn't fully understand it. He goes to the Capulet party knowing fully well that he's not supposed to be there. And that's even before he knows who Juliet is. So I think his perspective on that feud is not as severe as maybe his parents' is. So that's one way of looking at his perspective. When we're talking about character perspective, it's usually going to pop up in the multiple choice, and it's going to be specific to a small passage. So it might be like, what is Romeo's perspective on Friar Lawrence's advice about marriage? So in that case, it'd be that he brushes it off, or he doesn't fully consider it or something. That'd be his perspective on that specific passage. Character contradictions, I think right here is our biggest contradiction. In the very first scene, we see a very lovelorn Romeo wandering the streets, very sad because Rosalind doesn't give him the time of day. That's our first introduction to him, and his parents are even concerned based on his behavior. But we also know by the end of that act, he's then in love with Juliet. So that's a contradiction in that he's so fixated and says he's in love with Rosalind in the beginning, but that changes as soon as he sees Juliet. And how we would analyze that contradiction is we would say that it shows his impulsiveness, or it foreshadows an ultimately bad decision by the end of the play. And that would be a contradiction. And then the last one is these two kind of go hand in hand, but it says consistent and inconsistent character traits. So I think Romeo, if we're talking about his impulsiveness, or we're talking about his romanticness, you know what I mean, the fact that he is a romantic, those are consistent traits. It does change for who he is fixated on, but he is impulsive throughout, and he is romantic throughout. Conversely, if we look at a character like the nurse, if you remember, she kind of goes from being lighthearted. As you know, she makes the really inappropriate sexual jokes in the beginning about Juliet, and she gets teased and stuff by Mercutio. But ultimately, she's a very serious character when she finds out that Juliet has died, and she sees what her actions have done, and that is a change in character. So the best way to kind of define this, like we said, is that idea of static versus dynamic, and being able to pick those things out. So all of these little notes we've made are things that we could analyze about Romeo's character. And so when we're looking at characters in plays, just like in novels, we're looking for these kind of same things. Let's switch over to structure. So we're going to start with just the basic review of prose or dramatic structure, which is that first you think about the sequence. That's what we mean when we say linear versus nonlinear. Shakespeare plays are all linear. They happen one event after the other. More modern plays do not follow that template necessarily. Some do jump around in time and show that differently, and that would be a non-linear. Remember, the types of non-linear are like episodic, meaning that there's little episodes. Lots of plays will do that. It has the frame model sometimes where it has an opening scene and then goes back in time and then comes back up. Anything where the timeline of events is mixed up would be a non-linear structure. And then, for example, you would analyze why is that the case. Now, analyzing why Shakespeare uses a linear structure is a little tough because, as we know, these plays are very old, and at the time they were all written linear. So it's really just kind of a product of the time, but as plays went further and people took more chances, especially as we moved into the modern era, people did more interesting things with the sequence in their plays. So trying to think of a good example. Most plays really are linear because it's confusing if the audience can't see the movement or the jumping around. But I'm trying to think. So a chorus line is a musical in which it's a bunch of people who are in a chorus line on a Broadway play. And it could be considered episodic because each character kind of gets their own little moment. It does, if I remember correctly, happen chronologically, but those little featured songs in that case would be like an episode. Like I said, most plays fall into the linear because it's confusing for an audience when we do anything non-linear, but it does happen sometimes. All right, techniques. We'll go through these quickly because we've been through these in semester 1, but a flashback, flash forward is an example of a structural choice because we're playing with the timeline. Foreshadowing because we're hinting at plot events that are going to come. In medias res, remember, it starts in the middle of the action, meaning that it starts with an exciting scene or something like that. An example, Shakespeare usually doesn't start with something terribly exciting like this. However, in scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet, remember there is the fight with the people on the street. However, an medias res would be like the fight would already be going on when the play started. For example, I saw Macbeth at the Guthrie not too long ago, and they kind of added that before they jumped into the play. They had like a World War II theme throughout their version of Macbeth. And so when the play started, there were guns firing, there were people dropping from the ceiling, things like that. And that is an example of starting right in the middle of the action. And then a subplot are those underlying stories. Trying to think. Well, a good example, I mean, it does play a big role in Romeo and Juliet would be the issue with Paris and the fact that he wants to marry Juliet. That's really kind of part of the primary plot, but some plays will have like a secondary story that's happening at the same time. For example, there might be a love story when there's a bigger conflict happening throughout the play, and that would be a subplot. Conflict, just to review these quickly, there's man versus self, which is an internal struggle in a character. Man versus a society or a group, which is one character pitted against multiple. Versus nature would be any natural elements, the weather, storms, animals, those are all kind of pieces of nature. Man would be just another character. Man versus reality is when a character is in conflict with their own reality. So to make sense of that, what I mean is that if a character does not want to accept their life as it is, that could be a man versus reality. Technology, remember, it could be like gadgets and new technologies kind of interfering with a character's life, but it could also just be anything that's a new invention, a new product that's creating conflict. And then very rare, character versus author. Plays do this, I think, more than books do this, to be honest, because plays have what's called the fourth wall. So if we are talking about a play stage, right? Here's my stage. These are my walls right here. So this is wall 1. Okay, and then the audience is right here. This is wall 1, this is wall 2, this is wall 3. So when they say they're breaking the fourth wall, it's all those moments where they kind of reach out and talk to the audience. And sometimes there have been plays, and none of them are coming to my head right now, of course, where they will make fun of the playwright or say, like, what a stupid idea that was, or comment things like that. So man versus author is more common in plays, but of these last 3, reality, technology, and author, again, are very rare. So when we're talking about dramatic structure, there's a few terms that we need to understand. The acts are the primary movements of the play. And when I say movements, I'm not saying like standing up and crossing the room. I'm talking like in terms of music. So if you have a symphony, it's written in movements, which are the big pieces, okay? So an act is the big pieces of the play. So example, if you've been to a play, if there's an intermission, it's usually happening between 2 acts because that's a logical place to break. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with our example below. Scenes are the moments. We've talked about moments before in prose. And they're usually in a single setting. Now, some plays are set in the same place the entire time, like The Mousetrap by Agatha Christie, but a scene, because plays are done on a stage, is usually the changes in setting, because they have to close the curtain so they can move things around and all that, so they end the scene. And the scenes make up the acts. Soliloquies are speeches for characters where they are alone on stage. That's really their qualifying features, that they are alone. Asides are when the actors talk to the audience. And these are very common in Shakespeare, just little side comments that are usually have, oh my gosh, I can't write, a little note that says aside, and then it goes on to say what they're going to say. Monologues are just speeches by one character. And stage directions are the actions the actors should take, or any kind of information provided for the actors. Stage directions in Shakespeare are very limited because they were meant to be traveling plays, which meant that they didn't have a lot of time for fancy settings. They didn't have a lot of time for costumes and things like that, so they tried to keep it to a bare minimum. It's pretty much just so-and-so enters, so-and-so exits, so-and-so stabs so-and-so, and that's the extent of it. Okay, and then very quickly, let's just look at the Shakespearean plot arc. This is the plot arc you're familiar with, and Shakespeare plays are the perfect embodiment of it, okay? Because the first part, as you know, is the exposition, and in Shakespeare, that's always Act 1. They set up the conflicts, introduce the characters, all of that good stuff. Then you have rising action. And in Shakespeare, that's always Act 2, where the conflict comes in. So example, Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet is when we learn about the feud in the family. We learn who Romeo is, who Juliet is. We learn about their personalities. Act 2 then is when Romeo is really pursuing his love for Juliet, and ultimately at the end of Act 2 marries her. The climax is always in Act 3. In Romeo and Juliet, that would be the street fight in which Mercutio and Tybalt are both killed, because that is what adds the greatest conflict for the two lovers. falling action, or if you want to be fancy, it's called the denouement in French. That would be Act 4 of Shakespeare plays, usually short. And as you might guess, the resolution is always Act 5. And if it's a tragedy, it just means lots of people are going to die. If it's a comedy, people are going to get married. So that said, the Shakespearean plot arc is the exact plot arc that we talked about in the past that we've learned as young readers. And that plot arc is really a product of Shakespeare's plays, because that's kind of the structure that stories once kind of all fell into. Now we know they kind of do their own thing and break from the pattern a lot. But this is kind of like the foundation of what created the structures we know now today. All right, that's all I got. Thanks, guys.